I'm here with Peter Dunne, former Cabinet Minister and former leader of United Future. He's now a political commentator. Kia ora, Peter, and thanks for chatting with me.
Kia ora, Andrew. It's always good to talk to you. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Peter, you're a keen follower of politics in New Zealand. How do you see things at a national level going forward to the election in the next 4 months?
Well, it's fascinating. The polls are sort of coming and going, but I keep a rolling average of the polls, and what they show at the moment is a virtual dead heat between the National ACT bloc and Labour, Greens, Maori Party. Now, that's moved about a bit, but I think we're going to get a very close election result, whatever side comes through. And the risk of that then, of course, is some instability and another election perhaps in 18 months' time, but we'll have to wait and see.
So you think that's a possibility, that there could be stability? So if the left got in, it could be so unstable that we have an early election after that?
Yeah, yes, I do. I mean, I think the way things are looking at the moment, if the National ACT bloc doesn't get a majority, then you're going to be reliant on Labour and the Greens with the possible support of Te Pāti Māori. And it seems to me that there's the potential for some volatility there. And if the numbers are really quite close and the government breaks up, then an early election looms as the obvious possibility. Now, whether that happens, of course, time will tell. We could be in a bit of a holding pattern just while people are sorting out what they're going to do. But we've only got 4 months to go. And if you just want to use a sporting analogy, no one's opened up a break on the field just yet. So they're leaving their run pretty tight.
Yeah. Now, last election was quite extraordinary because we had the Jacinda effect, or the red wave, as they called it, which sort of skewed everything, really. Do you expect more normal voting patterns to resume? And do you think we'll see a shift to the right?
And I think... Well, I think there's going to be a realignment. Whatever the outcome, I think the Labour Party is going to lose its outright majority. It's going to lose probably upwards of 15 to 20 seats. That will bring us back into a more normal pattern. And of course, that's where this whole issue about how the coalitions form becomes more important, because we're not going to have, I don't think, a majority government from a single party after this election. So what are the coalition lines? On the one hand, National ACT looks pretty clear if it gets the numbers. Labour and the Greens on the other, with the possible support of Te Pāti Māori if they need it. So, you know, it's shaping up as a more traditional election than the last one was.
And if I had asked you in January who would be Prime Minister, and if I asked you now, what would your answer be? I mean, obviously Jacinda was there in January, but would it have been a Labour Prime Minister, and what would it be now?
If you had asked me before the middle of January, I'd have said you'd have had the strong prospect of Christopher Luxon being the next Prime Minister. What do I think now? I think that's still more likely than not, but those odds are narrowing very, very quickly. And as I say, he could end up there by the skin of his teeth, but not for very long, or just missing out altogether. So I think we're in a much more fluid and volatile situation. And there's no real sign yet that either of the major parties is going to sort of launch the game breaker that puts them well over the top. So it's going to be quite tense, I think, right up until the end.
And now Chris Hipkins has had quite a tough time, because clearly he's got some ministers who don't read the cabinet manual very well. And Stuart Nash obviously took the fall for that. Do you think the likes of Michael Wood and Kerry Adlin have been a bit lucky in escaping relatively unscathed?
Yes, I do. I think there's been a bit of a double standard. I think that Stuart Nash's behaviour was unacceptable. I think there was no alternative in the end of his dismissal. But you can make an equally strong case, it seems to me, certainly for Michael Wood, to forget something's permissible, but not to forget to do it after 12 warnings. That seems to almost border on the deliberate avoidance. And the Kerry Allen case, the Minister of Justice, she should, of all people, know what the limits on ministers influencing or seeking to influence external agencies is. So I think both of them were let off lightly. I think the reason's quite simple. You can afford to lose one, that was Stuart Nash. Mecca Whaitiri walked out, that was a bit embarrassing. but you couldn't afford to lose 2 more without it looking like the ship was beginning to sink. And I think that's the only thing that saved them. Frankly, in normal circumstances, I think both those other ministers would be gone by now.
Yeah. Now, just getting back to Luxon, and you saying that it's looking like he could be Prime Minister, do you think he's got what it takes?
I do. I mean, the problem with every opposition leader is because they've got to be negative and opposing, the public forms a certain view of them. But invariably, when they become Prime Minister, they transition into a wider figure. I think Luxon's got that capability. The question for me, though, is whether he's got, firstly, the experience, because bear in mind he hasn't even been in Parliament a full term yet, and secondly, whether he's got the people around him. I think there are people like Nicola Willis, Erica Stamford, Chris Bishop. But beyond that, you start to think, well, who else has he got who's going to be the core of his team? Obviously, David Seymour and the ACT people will bring in a different element as well. Yeah. But I think given his background and given just the way he's brought the National Party up from being a basket case 18 months ago to now being a contender, yeah, he would make a good Prime Minister if he got the opportunity. But it's not clear that New Zealanders want to give him that just yet.
Yeah. Now, obviously, our focus is on Hawke's Bay. How do you see this region as being a battleground between National and Labour?
Well, you've got two seats that are obviously very much on everyone's radar screen, Napier and Tukituki. Can I talk about Tukituki first? I think that's going to be the harder one for Labour to retain for a couple of reasons. It's a traditional national seat. It was one of the seats that clearly swung Labour's way last time because of that red wave. So that's always going to be an uphill battle. I don't think also that Anna Lorck has particularly distinguished herself in the 3 years in Parliament. And she's got, by all accounts, a strong opponent, Catherine Wedd, coming up from the National Party. So I think Tukituki is going to be a very difficult seat for Labour. Also factor in the consequences of the recent cyclones and devastation in the area too, and it's all a pretty difficult mix. Napier should be a Labour hold. It's a traditional Labour seat, but you've got a strong candidate for National in Katie Nyman. You've got also the whole issue around Stuart Nash. Now, that's where I think the selection of Mark Hutchison becomes quite interesting, because he's clearly a very close Nash associate and has been a strong supporter of his over the years. If there's a feeling in the electorate that Nash was hard done by Hipkins and was treated unfairly, then I think Hutchison's obviously got a huge advantage. He's got no baggage. But if there's a feeling in the local electorate that, you know, this was all a bit shady, that Nash did play a bit fast and loose and wasn't completely upfront with what was going on, the fact that Hutchison is closely associated with him could be a negative. I just don't know the local scene well enough to draw that conclusion, but I think that's a real risk for them, that Hutchison, who looks pretty good on paper, may suffer if he's seen to be too closely associated with Nash.
Yeah. Because Napier's always been an interesting electorate where, you know, it's sort of the party vote often goes to National, but they are prepared to split their vote, and that's shown with Nash, and all they want is a good, hard-working MP on the ground. And Hutchinson has been, as you say, close to Nash. But Katie Nyman has had a free run for the last few months with no candidate. Do you think that will benefit her?
Well, I'm sure it does. I mean, she comes from a very well-known Hawke's Bay family. She ran last time. I think she ran a pretty good campaign in those adverse circumstances for National. And she's had, as you say, a free run now for the last few months, where she's been the only sort of candidate in the field, or the only major candidate in the field. All of that will have helped her recognition. All of that will have helped her establish herself even more firmly in the electorate. Yeah. And if there's any sort of a swing to National, then she's in with a real chance. But, you know, these things are all ifs and buts. As you say, Napier has historically been a very parochial electorate, very supportive of its MP. Now, it just depends how that support goes once Stuart Nash is off the scene.
Yeah. Now, there has been a groundswell of opinion among communities affected by the cyclone that the government hasn't been listening to them. Will this help National?
It certainly won't help Labor. And I think that was always the risk. Labor talked big after the cyclones about what it was going to do, but wasn't able to deliver. And consequently, people feel disenfranchised or let down. If you draw a parallel with the Christchurch earthquakes, and the way in which National reacted after that was initially criticised for being too cautious, but it didn't want to overpromise and underdeliver. In the end, it still suffered blame for the fact that people's homes weren't rebuilt quickly enough. And I think that's the same factor at play here, that Labor's going to suffer for homes not being rebuilt, land not being restored, all those sorts of things. Not in any rational way, because I don't think it would be capable, any government would be capable of effecting a total recovery in just a few short months.
Yeah.
But people feel these things understandably very personally. It's their homes, their livelihood, and that's all that matters. And if the government can't deliver on that, however unreasonable that expectation might be, then they pay a price. Now that's another sort of factor to put into the mix here and could well affect the outcome in both seats.
Yeah. Now, just getting back to Stuart Nash, quite a spectacular fall, and people who know him would say, well, that's the way he rolls, kind of thing. He lives life on the edge and that. Do you think he was unfairly treated?
No, I don't. I certainly agree with your first point about living life on the edge and sort of, the fact that he's reacted in a pretty much taken it on the chin way proves that. But I think there was a certain, I'm not sure whether it was naivety or arrogance about the way in which he could act as a cabinet minister and get away with it. I'm astounded, really, both with all of the ministers we've mentioned today, as you said right at the beginning, that they don't seem to have read or comprehended the rules set out by the Cabinet Office and the Cabinet Manual. I'm particularly since, in my time as a minister, the Cabinet Office was quite punctilious every year at coming to ministers and saying, no, we just need to go through your return about your potential conflicts or lack of, and just make sure we're all absolutely clear. So it's not as though Stuart Nash would have been acting without any knowledge of what the implications were or what the risks were and what the do's and don'ts were. But as you say, he's a somewhat sort of full speed ahead and damn the torpedoes guy, action man, all of that sort of thing. And a lot of people like that. A lot of people say, well, that's good on him, for being sort of focused rather than sort of tied down by bureaucracy. But unfortunately, in a job like he had as a cabinet minister, you don't have the option of just playing by the rules as it suits. You've got to play by them all the time.
Yeah, because I had a good interview with him a few weeks back, and he was saying he had some strong views. He felt that he should have been able to allow to criticise the judge, because his view was, who is the judiciary accountable for in New Zealand? Yeah. Does he have a point with that? Are they unaccountable?
Well, I think he does have a point, but the problem is in our system, in the Westminster system, it's not the role of ministers to be that critic. If he was an ordinary member of Parliament, I think he would have got away with it, because that would have been seen as he's not part of the executive branch of government criticising the judiciary. But as a member of the executive, there are certain constraints, and unfortunately, he didn't abide by them.
Yeah. Do you think he was a good minister overall, though?
I think he was an enthusiastic minister. I think that he certainly put his heart and soul into it, and I think he could look back on a record of some achievement, yes.
Yeah. Now, just getting back to the election race, if you came down here, the one thing you would notice is the ACT signs, billboards everywhere. They've flooded the place. Some say against the rules in the Tuk election, but that they're not really being enforced. Do you think this is a deliberate ploy by David Seymour and them to target some areas where they might get votes?
Yes, I do. And I think that ACT's being very strategic this time, perhaps unlike any time beforehand, and working out where their support is likely to be strongest and going all out for it. And the other thing they're doing, I'm not sure that they're doing it in the Hawke's Bay area, but they're certainly doing it in parts of Auckland. In the Tamaki seat, for instance, is saying, don't just give us your party vote, give us your electorate vote as well. So a two-tick campaign, whereas previously they've always run a party vote campaign. I think this is as much about getting people to bolster support for ACT I don't think they really harbour serious thoughts of winning additional seats, but they certainly want to be a strong player in any national-led government. And I think they'd be looking to get 15% plus of the vote if they possibly can.
Well, that's quite something. The other big talking point, and you mentioned her earlier, is Mecca Faituri, quite a sensational defection, and caught everyone by surprise, even her cabinet colleagues and that. What is your assessment of what happened and why she did this?
Well, many years ago, back in the early 1980s, Matt Rata left the Labour Party to form the Manamoto Hawke Party, principally because he felt stumped by a reshuffle that the then Labour leader Bill Rowling had undertaken, and I think moved him off the front bench. I think there are elements of this in the Faituri defection. I don't think she's given yet a compelling reason from a sort of a philosophical standpoint as to why she's done it, but I do think she felt, certainly when she was sidelined by Jacinda Ardern after those allegations against her, and now when she wasn't appointed to the full cabinet by Chris Hipkins, I think she's felt taken a bit for granted, left out of the loop, bypassed, and I think all of these things sort of led to her feeling disillusioned and disenfranchised, and consequently opting for Te Pāti Māori. Now, it may well be an inspired move. She may well win Ikaroa Rāwhiti. I think it's going to be a battle, but she's got name recognition, she's got 10 years service to the electorate behind her, and she could be a very strong contender. Of course, that changes the dynamic as well, because if there are more Te Pāti Māori MPs in the parliament after the election, and Labour needs them to be able to govern, then she's in a quite strong position to come back and say, well, hey, here I am, you can't ignore me this time.
Yeah, because Labour hasn't got a candidate yet, and I know that they've been trying very hard, even like approaching the local iwi chair to try and get him to stand, and he's not interested, and a whole host of other names. Even Willie Jackson hinting that he might have to step in if there's no one else. Do you think they've lost the seat already because they just haven't got their act together?
Well, they've clearly been taken by surprise by events. They obviously had no preparation other than the prospect of Mecca being the candidate. And I think they are in a very difficult and parlous position, actually. If they haven't got a candidate and are struggling to get one, and we're 4 months out from an election, unless a superstar emerges, and I know there was talk at one stage, I think, of Tane Randall stepping into the breach, and that's not going to happen, I think they are going to struggle. She's got name recognition, she'll have residual loyalty, and she'll be able to say, well, look, I'm here basically for Ikaroa Rāwhiti first and, other interests second. Vote for me, I'm your local voice. She's in a strong position. If she does that and wins the seat, not only does it bloody Labour's nose, but it actually also just has an implication, as I said before, for post-election calculations.
Now, the latest development, and you might not have caught up with it, but we broke over the weekend that Heather Skipworth, who she replaced and then went to stand in the Tukituk race, she has now withdrawn from that contest. And I've heard that it's because she was unhappy with her list placing. I heard she was as low down as 20 or something like that in Te Pāti Māori. Politics is a brutal game, eh?
It is, and my ears pricked up when I heard that she'd withdrawn for personal reasons. That's usually code for some degree of dissatisfaction or disagreement with what's going on. I think in one sense she's been pretty harshly treated. She was obviously preparing her campaign in Ikaroa Rāwhiti, suddenly to be pushed aside. And now to be treated this way by the party is pretty tough, and I can understand why she might have decided it's just not for her. Politics is brutal, and particularly parties that are feeling they've got a big chance of getting increased membership at the election. They'll be wanting to make sure their very best people are in the most electable positions. And unfortunately, there are a lot more people in parties who think they're in that sort of very best position than there are actual people in reality. So she'll be a casualty of that. And in that sense, it's a bit embarrassing for Te Pāti Māori, probably less embarrassing in Tukituki than it would have been had she pulled out in Ikaroa Rāwhiti.
Yeah.
But it's still going to cause a few problems, I think, come election time.
Who knows? We might see you as the Labour candidate in Ikaro Rafferty. That would be interesting.
That would be the ultimate irony, wouldn't it?
Yes, indeed. So now, almost done, but just apart from the current parliamentary parties, which other parties do you see coming in? NZ First, Top, Democracy NZ?
I don't see any of them making it because I think that 5% threshold is still very high. I don't think any of them are likely to win electorate seats. New Zealand First, I know, is talking up its chances in the far north electorate, but I don't really see that happening, although that's going to be a fascinating contest between National, the Labour incumbent, and New Zealand First. Top, again, needs to win probably the Ireland electorate, but I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think National, who they're sort of hinting should stand aside for them, is going to do that. And for that reason, I don't really see any of the parties not in Parliament getting over the threshold. Now, the implication is if they do, what does that do for potential government formation post-election? Top, I think, would be more likely to align with National if it got the opportunity. New Zealand First, who knows? They've ruled out Labour, but I'm not sure National would be desperately keen to have them if it got that way. And the rest, Democracy New Zealand and some of the other smaller parties are just, I think, there to make up the numbers. They're not going to get into Parliament.
So if Winston's not there, who's going to be the kingmaker, would you say? Or which party is going to be the kingmaker?
Well, if it ends up as a real tie between the majors, then obviously Te Pāti Māori's into that position. And it seems to have now backed itself into the corner of being a stooge for Labour, which may actually detract from its support. After all, if you're in the Māori electorates, you've got a choice between the Labour candidate and the Pāti Māori candidate, and they're both going to end up sort of backing each other. Why not just vote for the Labour candidate? I would have thought they'd have been a bit brighter to have kept their powder dry and possibly tried to leverage off both of the major parties. That could still happen, but they seem to have backed themselves into a corner. So the question then becomes, how does the rest of the electorate feel with the possibility that they are the kingmaker? And I think that might just harden a few attitudes to make sure that either of the other parties, National or ACT or Labour or the Greens, get sufficient votes to be able to form a government in their own right.
Yeah. Now, prediction time. So we want to come back after October 14 and say you got it right or whatever. So who's going to get it?
Look, at this stage, I think if you look at the long-term trends, I'd say it would be a National ACT coalition by a whisker. But as I said before, that could have within it the seeds of its own instability.
Okay, Peter Dunne, thank you very much for your time. Always good to get your views on this, and hopefully we can chat to you again in the next few months and see how things are going.
Look forward to it. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.